Hi, welcome. This is Daryl Pereira from the IBM Academic Initiative team, and today I'm very happy to say we have with us an interesting presenter. And let me just give a little bit of background here. I'll say in my job, and you see in many roles, especially at Worldwide, as companies look at worldwide social media initiatives, it doesn't take long to run into the question of what is social media consumption like in different parts of the world. So whereas if you have a US focus or even predominantly Western Europe focus, you may be familiar with Twitter, Facebook, Google+, these kind of networks. But in different parts of the world, two things happen. One is that these popular networks have different coverage models, have different usage cases, and in some instances can be blocked. And there's also, in addition to that, there'll be other social networks and other environments which may be popular, especially in the business context. So in some research I was doing, came across some wonderful research by GlobalWebIndex. And today, happy to be joined by Brett Petersen, who is the director of Stream, which is the consulting arm of GlobalWebIndex, and he's going to take us through some of the recent research I have available there. So, Brett, with that, if I can turn it over to yourself.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Daryl. Really appreciate it. Very, very kind things said there. As Daryl mentioned, I'm the director of Stream. My name is Brett Petersen, and the first thing, what we're going to go through today is our latest report, which is called Stream Social, and it's our quarterly social platforms update around the world. And by social platforms, I mean everything from social networks to microblogs to forums to video sharing sites, etc. All the different forms of social media. As an encompassing word, we call them social platforms. So let's just get in. And I'm going to go through briefly what we're going to talk about today. And this whole presentation is an excerpt of a report that's available in full through the GLO website, but it's a very interesting global overview of the social media landscape. So we're going to look at global trends in social platform adoption. We're going to have a little bit of detailed demographics on users, and then we're going to look at some a deep dive in terms of country usage and behaviors and the usage of all these different platforms around the world. And you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen all the different kind of social networks and social platforms that we cover around the world. So we have a list of about 45 to 50 social platforms, and we'll get some great data on how those are being used all around the world. So, but the first thing, and it's really important to understand how we collect the data in the first place. So what I'm going to go through initially is just a brief introduction into the Global Web Index, because I think it's really important to understand how we structure the data and how we collect the data, because what we do is we do online surveys, and I think surveys is a type of research methodology that people generally associate kind of with a pre-digital age. But what we find is that by using surveys, we're actually able to get a much more comprehensive view of the overall digital environment than a lot of other people can. And so there are definitely some big pros to using a survey methodology. Firstly, I want to go through a few key points about the Global Web Index. The first one being that we are global. We cover 31 different countries around the world, and that survey is the same in every country we go to, but it is localized by language and by example brands. The other key point is that we're multi-device. So not only can we cover and look at what people are doing via their PCs, but we also ask them what they do via their mobile and their tablet devices. And I'm sure, as a lot of you watching this will know, mobile and tablets, as we'll see even throughout the presentation, mobile and tablets are really, really driving the way that people are using social media, the way they're using online, and just how they consume media in general around the world. So it's very important to have a very holistic multi-device view. The other key point about Global Web Index is that social media is one of our key focuses in our survey. It's actually the biggest section of our survey. So not only are we looking at the social platforms that people are using, so whether they're using Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, but we're also looking at what they're doing on those platforms across the different devices that they have. And so that gives us a very, very interesting and very comparable view when we're thinking about, especially for a lot of our clients where they're looking at advertising and marketing strategies, how they can leverage those different types of devices and the different types of content they'll need. And the main point is, and I think at GlobalWebIndex, our tagline is know your audience. And we really want to make sure that people understand not only the demographics behind kind of the audience they're using and understanding the demographics behind the different device usage and social platform usage, but also understand what the passions are, what the purchasing behaviors are, what the kind of the attitudes of the people are in each of the targets that they're trying to get to and understand, as well as ones that their competitors might be using, etc. So it's really consumer focused, it's really social media focused, and it's global. As I mentioned, we're in 31 countries around the world. Our biggest region is in the Asia-Pacific region. We also have quite large coverage in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then we also cover the main markets in North America and 2 big markets in South America. All in all, that gives us a coverage of about 87% of the global internet population. And that's actually an important point that I want to point out now, is that all of the research and all of the, when you look at percentages, that, as we'll see in a minute, all that will be covered. It's always a percentage of the internet population, either globally or at the country level. So it's not a percentage of the national population, but of the internet population of that market. And lastly, as I alluded to earlier, I wanted to just discuss our methodology very briefly. So our methodology is online surveys. We work with a number of panel partners around the world who have existing panels of respondents. We field our survey to them, and then they simply give us the data back. Now, there are a lot of things we do behind the scenes to make sure that that data is as reliable as it can be, and that's what makes our methodology actually very complex, is the fact of how we do sample structuring. So our samples will be quoted to ensure that our internet representative samples are representative based on their age, gender, and demographic and educational levels in each country. The survey is always localized by language and different brands. So in China, for example, if we're talking about social networks, the examples will be using our Renren and Tencent rather than Facebook and Twitter, for example. And the key part of our service is our quarterly delivery. So our data is delivered once a quarter, and each of our respondents within an entire year are unique. So each quarter will have a completely new set of respondents that won't have taken the survey before. So that's very, very important background to understand kind of the basis of the data and understand where we're coming from, because our figures will differ from those published by Facebook. They will differ from those published by Google, but it's because of the differences in methodologies. And I hope you're convinced of kind of the pros of using a methodology like ours. So let's get straight into the data. So what we're going to go through first is a global overview of social platforms. And the first thing is comparing side by side account ownership and active usage at a global level of the main social platforms worldwide. And if we start on the left and we look at the account ownership as of Q1 2013, we can see that Facebook clearly dominates the global social media landscape, essentially. I don't think that's a surprise for anyone. Below that, we have YouTube, Google+, Twitter, so that's always a key stat for us. Google+ actually has more accounts than Twitter does for various reasons. I'm sure I'll get to those as we go through the presentation. But I think one of the interesting points I wanted to highlight right at the beginning is after Google+ and Twitter, we see the big Chinese social networks coming in. So we have Sina Weibo, Qzone, Tencent Weibo, and Weibo in Chinese simply means messenger. So, and then Tencent, Youku, and then LinkedIn comes in probably in about 10th place. But what that really speaks to is just the sheer size of the Chinese market. So even at a global level, while we only ask Qzone in China, for example, it still is 25% of global internet users saying they use that platform. And that really speaks to the sheer size of the Chinese market. If we move over and we look at active users on the right-hand side of the chart, we can see that Facebook by far has the biggest active user base. So just over 50% of global internet users, aged 16 to 64, mind you, are using Facebook at least on a monthly basis. Second is Google+, which for us it's always very interesting. Ever since we started tracking Google+ in early 2012, we've seen that Google Plus started off and has grown quite quickly, and that's really due, we believe, to obviously the way that Google's rolled out the Google Plus platform by making people, if you get an Android phone, you have to sign up to a Google Plus account to use any of Google's services. As a new user, you have to sign up with a Google Plus account, and that works across Gmail, YouTube, Maps, Android, etc. So it's really important the way that Google's rolled that out, but importantly as well, the active usage of that platform is up at around 26% of global internet users. So even though they're forcing it to roll out in that way, it's still generating a lot of active usage. YouTube comes in lower. I think that YouTube is an interesting distinction, simply because you don't actually have to have an account to be an active user of YouTube. And I think when we look at active users in this question, they have to have had accounts beforehand before they can be classified as an active user. And with YouTube, it's slightly different. So it's important to note that as we go through. Yes, Daryl.
Yeah, if I could ask you just to repeat that last point. I think there may have been, I had a gap in the audio on this side. I don't know if it was just me or if it was across the board, but if you could just repeat that last point. That's okay.
Okay, sure. So going and looking at YouTube, and I think a lot of people, they have a lot of questions about why do we have such low YouTube figures. And as we move through and we look at the actual millions figure for YouTube, YouTube is one of those, it's unique in the social media space in the sense that you don't actually have to have an account to be an active user, because many people will go to YouTube and watch videos but never ever sign up for an account. And so in our question, we don't classify anyone as an active user unless they already say that they have an account on the service. And so it's important to note as we go through that YouTube this is not visits to YouTube in the sense that they might be active users for watching videos, but it's actually people who are active and also have an account on YouTube. As we go down, and the active usage chart, we see again the big Chinese services dominating at a global level the active usage, but we're also getting into big services like LinkedIn. Pinterest becomes in very small, just under 5% of the global media space, and that's very different from what we see in the United States and Canada, where Pinterest does have quite a significant following. Around the world, however, that's not the case. So again, an interesting point to make out there. Orkut, MySpace, Badoo. So at a global level, all of these are obviously really small in terms of their absolute penetration. But it's when we get to the country level that we really start to see the differentiation come out and what we need to be doing to hit users on these platforms to understand how they're using them. Moving on to the next slide, this is looking at the growth of the active usage in these social platforms over the last 9 months, so from Q2 2012 to Q1 2013, at a global level again. And the thing that immediately stands out is that Twitter is actually the fastest growing social platform. Twitter is not a social network, it is a microblog service. It's the fastest growing social platform over the last 9 months, and it's growing at about 44% over the last 9 months in terms of its active user base. What's interesting is that vKontakte, which is a Russian social network service, very similar to Facebook, has grown at over 40%. If we go down, we can see we have a social network in Taiwan called Ini, and that's grown quite significantly. And even Facebook growing very quickly over the last 9 months, with active usage growing by about 38% at a global level. And one of the interesting things as we move through, and if you go down the list there, you can see that there's the Chinese social platforms like Sina Weibo and Tencent Weibo, and another Russian social platform called Odnoklassniki, which is growing quite quickly as well. But if we go down to the ones that are actually decreasing very significantly, it's a lot of our local social networks, which for us is very interesting because we've seen up until probably about the end of 2012, we've seen these social networks being able to maintain a lot of their market share. But there's been a very steep decline, and this data quite clearly shows how it is the social networks at a local level like Mixi in Japan, Copain d'Avant in France, Plurk in Taiwan, Twenty in Spain. So a lot of these very local social platforms that are losing a lot of active usage, and it really shows just how the big global players like Facebook, like Twitter, Google Plus are actually coming to dominate in a lot of those markets, with the notable exception of China and Russia. So obviously, if we're thinking at a global level, we can still consider Facebook, Twitter, and Google Plus to be the three main platforms in terms of social media usage, but Russia and China are going to be the two major exceptions to that statement. So I just wanted to move through and look at the engagement split, because this is a very interesting split as well, and we can see, again, this is at a global level, and we can see account ownership for Facebook at 859 million. At Google Plus, we have 602 million account holders at a global level, and Twitter 476 million. Now, if we compare that to visits, and you'll notice, I'm going to start off with Google Plus here, because we're actually comparing, for Google, we're comparing overall Google visitation. So this is visits in the last month through a PC or laptop. And to Google services, so this includes search, it includes Gmail, it includes all the things that Google is, because that's really what Google Plus is about. Google Plus is more of it's a layer rather than a destination like Facebook. Google Plus is a layer that kind of connects everything at a social level through all of Google's services, as opposed to Facebook, which is very much a destination, and they want people to stay on Facebook itself, and that's where you go. So it's important to note that people can distinguish between Google and Google Plus itself, but at the same time it shows the full potential for Google Plus, having 1.3 or 1.13 billion users to Google in the last month as of Q1 2013. Facebook, again, visits in the last month, 778.2, so not as many as the account owners. And Twitter has 351 million visits on a monthly basis. Now, if we go down and look at the active usage column, this is where it gets even more interesting, because we want to understand, while it's great that they have all these accounts and everything, we want to understand how the active usage varies around the world. And with Facebook, we can see that there's a very high active usage ratio to total account ownership ratio. And then with Google Plus, we can see that Google Plus has 359 million accounts, or active users, sorry, as opposed to 602 million accounts, and a similar story for Twitter with 296 as opposed to 476 million accounts. So just to clarify that point, these pie charts break down that proportion of active users to non-active users at a global level across the five main, kind of the five main social networks, but the five major global players, excluding YouTube. So with Facebook, we have an 82% active usage ratio, which means that 82% of account holders are active at least on a monthly basis. For Twitter and Google Plus, that falls to around 60. And for Pinterest, we're falling to about 53, and LinkedIn, again, at 51%. So really showing how the active usage varies at a global level. But again, the main point being that this is going to vary very significantly from country to country as we go around the world, and that is what we're going to do next. So we're going to go
One thing there, Brett, if I may ask a question just before we get into the next section. When you talk about active usage there, are you talking about that would be somebody interacting with, let's say, with Facebook? Does it mean that they've either liked or commented or posted? Is that how you define active usage?
Sure, that's a great question. I apologize for not getting to that earlier. By active users, what we ask our respondents in our survey, we ask them, have you used or contributed to that service in the past month? And so what we feel like we really get, we get people who perceive that they're using these platforms on an active basis. And that's a very important distinction, because we're not going to be measuring people who might be going just to that site, but we'll be measuring people who they might be sharing photos directly through their mobile phone on Google Plus or Facebook without ever actually going to Facebook, but they're still an active user. So that's how we define it, and that's kind of our reasoning for that definition.
Okay, which differs to view, and then the viewership that you showed is just purely just somebody that's gone and they've seen a page, let's say, or seen some element from Facebook.
Right. That visitation figure is going to be the visitation in the last month. Is going to, we ask people, have you visited that site, and they'll see the logo, and we ask them, have they visited in the last month.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on. So now we're going to get into the social platforms local market deep dive. And I think the main thing that we're going to look at firstly is Facebook account owners between Q1 2012 and Q1 2013. So what we're going to look at here is Facebook versus Twitter on the next slide, and then versus Google Plus, to see how usage of those platforms varies across different markets. Because as we saw really before, we could really get into a China-specific or a Russia-specific kind of discussion, but it is these three major social platforms that are really starting to take over in these countries. But the usage does vary quite significantly. And so even as at a business context, we can take this away and employ it in our own strategies. But if we look at the change in, so what we're looking at here is the growth in Facebook account owners between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the change in active Facebook users between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013. So the first thing to notice is, in terms of at least account ownership, it's all these countries where we had significant falls in the local social platforms where we're seeing the highest growth. And that does hold true as well, actually, for active usage. But it's Japan with just over 40% growth in the last 9 months in terms of active Facebook usage. Indonesia, again, South Korea, India, Saudi Arabia. So some huge growth in the number of active users on Facebook. Now, if we contrast that down to a lot of the markets where Facebook already has a very strong following, and it was honestly actually very saturated, where it's the United States, Germany, Italy, the UK, where Facebook is by far the biggest network, but the number of accounts is growing very slowly. In the United States, at 7%, in the UK, down towards 3%, Canada, just barely registering any growth at all, about 1%. So some very, very differing trends globally in terms of account ownership on Facebook. And then we see China. I think that's another one of the interesting things about our methodology, is that we actually ask Chinese internet users if they're using Facebook on a monthly basis. And in the past, we're seeing quite significant figures for China, with around about 10% of users actually saying, yeah, I've used Facebook on a monthly basis. But as you can see, that's fallen quite significantly by just over 30% between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013. And I think we've done a lot of research into why that might be. I sent a colleague of mine out to China to kind of understand and talk to the local people and see how easy it actually is to use Facebook. And what we've discovered is that the government has really been cracking down on the use of virtual private networks and the use of proxy internet services in order to allow people to log into Facebook. So some interesting trends there, and that those efforts by the government to crack down on that usage are reflected in the data. Jumping over to active usage, between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013, we could see that India, the Netherlands, South Korea, Japan, and the United States are the top 5 fastest growing markets in terms of active usage among Facebook. And for us that was really interesting, because if I take the United States as an example, we have over 53% active user growth at the country level, as opposed to 7% account growth. And so that really begs the question, well, what is driving that growth in active usage? And I think I have a great slide that will really highlight this in a minute, but it really comes down to mobile usage and the ability of people to use what we call real-time social. Social media really lends itself to real-time interactions, and smartphones are the perfect window to capture that usage. And I think that's really reflected in the active user figures that we're seeing, especially for Facebook, for the other platforms as well. And pretty much across the board, no matter where we go in the world, in Saudi Arabia, nearly 40% growth in active usage on Facebook. And all the way down to other countries like even Germany, countries that are typically not as engaged with social media as some others, especially in Southeast Asia, but countries like Germany, let's see, what other countries? Germany, Canada, and in fact it's one, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is actually a really striking one, because they're historically one of the least engaged social media markets, but as we can see, nearly 60% growth in Facebook active users in the last 9 months. If we move on to Google Plus, Google Plus, again, is always a really interesting case, but we've seen Google Plus usage absolutely skyrocket in South Korea. Over 200% growth between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013 in account ownership on Google Plus. And if you're looking for a reason behind that, I think the success of Samsung's of Galaxy smartphones and tablet devices will be one of the key drivers of the take-up of Google Plus in South Korea. South Korea, if we look at the device data that we have, we can see that Samsung very, very much dominates that market, Samsung being a South Korean company. So that really attributes, the success that Google's having, it can be attributed to its push through Android as well. But it's also markets like Japan, Sweden, Indonesia, showing nearly 50% growth in Google Plus account ownership between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013. On the same...
Brett, on that South Korea point, so you're saying that because Samsung, I know they make very popular Android devices, it's that link really between Android and Google Plus, which is helping to drive this growth that we're seeing here. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
The way that Google Plus is integrated into that operating system.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the point that I want to get across. I think because at least, I'm not sure when they started this, but every new Android activation is required to have a Google Plus account. You cannot, the phone won't work. You can't use the services without Google Plus. So, so it's important, and I think it's really the way. And now is a good time to actually get into more about how Google Plus is being used, because, as you can see from the active usage slide, in the United States, it's actually the fastest growing Google Plus market from Q2 2012 to Q1 2013. And I think for Google itself, this has been quite a coup, and South Korea is there in second place, Australia, Canada, Singapore. Google Plus is really, as I mentioned before, it's not the destination socially in terms of like what we might think of as Facebook being. Twitter also is not a destination site. I'll get to that in a minute, but Google Plus is being integrated so much through Google's services, not only Gmail and YouTube, but also if you think about the hardware, as we just mentioned, Android. But if we start to think about the new services as well that Google's really starting to push, like Google Now, where you're provided the information either through your smartphone, through your browser, or through your tablet device, provided information that Google believes you'll need before you even need it, and that's based on what it learns from you as you use all of its services. And so Google Plus becomes a very important kind of, I don't want to say conduit's not the right word, but it becomes a very important source of information for Google to learn more about you. And by doing that, I don't want to make that sound creepy in a sense, because it's not creepy. They're doing it so that they can provide the best possible kind of service to you, and therefore the best possible avenue for brands to get in touch with you as well. That's the commercial side of it, but Google Plus is really, it's a layer throughout Google services, and for a lot of people around the world, Google really is the gateway to the internet, and I think that is what's really driving the growth in Google Plus usage across, and all the way down the scale. I think, and interestingly, of the top 3 major global social platforms, those being Facebook, Google Plus, and Twitter, Google Plus is the only one that's not actually banned in China officially. So, and it is in fact the largest of the 3 in China as well. So, this really, I hope this really kind of illustrates just kind of how dynamic the global social media environment is, and really how these services are really pushing for growth across the world. And obviously, we'd need to do another session on China, and probably another one after that on Russia, to understand those markets and their social media consumption habits. But at least at a global level, it is these 3 big social platforms that are really, really making the most headway. Lastly, we'll finish off with Twitter. I think we're seeing similar trends with Twitter, and I think the important point is that this is all really being driven by mobile. Mobile is helping all of these platforms really gain accounts and active usage figures. So Twitter is growing very, very quickly, not only in Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, some of the big emerging markets, but also in the United States. Twitter's shown over 30% growth between Q2 2012 and Q1 2013 in terms of active user numbers. In Indonesia, over 40% growth. Down at the other end of the spectrum, we've actually lost users in the UK Taiwan, and Vietnam. So while it's broadly a positive picture, there are a couple markets where Twitter actually is declining. Across the board, though, pretty strong growth across the board in terms of account usage. Active usage as well, again, the United States comes out very, very highly. And I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people, especially Americans that I talk to, in the fact that they ask, well, surely the United States is leading the way in terms of social media usage. That's where all these platforms were born. That's where the action is happening. But we really look at it and you realize that it's simply not the case. I really attribute this to smartphone take-up actually being slower in the United States than it is in especially a lot of emerging markets. And I think when you get into the emerging market scene, and social is really key for those countries, we start to see that they've actually leapfrogged the West in terms of technology. They don't own PCs, and they haven't owned those for a while, but what they've done is instead of going out and buying a laptop or PC when they actually have the disposable income, the new middle class, if we're talking in China or Indonesia or India, they're going straight to buying tablets and mobile and smartphones. And so that's a really important point to highlight the kind of the penetration of social among the internet users in those markets. But it also shows just why the U.S. is able to grow so quickly. It's because smartphone penetration is actually increasing very, very quickly in the United States. So some very interesting pan-global, pan-regional statistics here on Twitter growth around the world. And really to kind of finish off the presentation, and by all means, if there's any questions or anything, please either get in touch with Daryl or get in touch with myself, and I'll be more than happy to provide maybe a bit more understanding or some more kind of evidence around these numbers. But to finish off the presentation, I really wanted to really hit home with the point that mobile is really driving the growth in these social platforms. So these charts are a little bit difficult to read, and I've included a little blurb there. It literally says how to read these charts, and I've provided an example. So I'll use that to explain basically what's going on. So here I've created two different audiences of users, one being iOS users, so iPhone users, the other being Android users, so encompassing all Android users that we have within the survey. And then I'm benchmarking them to the average for each country. So the average for each country is 100, quite literally. And what we're going to see here is, if we take the Japanese example, if we look at Japan's Google Plus usage, we can see that iOS users, because their score for iOS is 233, that's an index against the average, that 133 more than 100 is the percentage that they're more likely to be using Google Plus than the average internet user. And the ultimate insight that we get is that iOS users are nearly 3 times as likely to be using Google Plus than the average Japanese internet user. Android, on the other hand, is much smaller, and that might actually be surprising given the fact that we've just been discussing how important Android is. But I think that Google's investment into iOS is definitely worth noting. Their apps and services through iOS are very, very strong, and so that's clearly having a strong effect. But also, if we move on to and look at Twitter, Twitter is probably my favorite example of how important mobile is for Twitter and its growth, is the fact that iOS and Android users far outweigh the average in terms of their usage. So we can see in Poland, they're 200% more likely, iPhone users are 200% more likely to be a Twitter user on an active basis than is the average Polish internet user. Countries all around the world as well, like France, Germany, nearly twice as likely in both of those countries. Canada, 50% more likely to be using Twitter if you're an iOS user. In the United States, even as well, 75% more likely to be using Twitter if you're an iOS user. And Android, similar proportions but less so. And I think that really speaks to kind of the diversity of Android as a whole. I mean, the iPhones is still quite a premium device. They still have a very, very not a niche audience, but a very specific audience that they sell to, whereas Android is a very fragmented market. There's lots of different types of devices to meet lots of different types of consumer needs. And so it is interesting to see how that plays out. And if we look at Facebook as well, we see a very similar picture where even in the United States. So we're scoring, even if we're scoring 25, that's still a significant over-indexing for the United States and iOS and Android users. So with an iPhone user being almost 25% more likely to be using Facebook than the average U.S. internet user. So it's stats like that that really hammer home, and evidence like this that really hammers home the fact that mobile is really driving social media all around the world, and that's a key point to get into. So to wrap up, I just want to go through kind of the final points that we've looked at, and Daryl, feel free to jump in with any other questions, and at the same time, feel free to jump in with any questions at any time through email or through Twitter. But the key points being, we're seeing active usage of the major global social platforms is really being driven by mobile at a global level across all markets. Now, these major social platforms are also dominating the global social media scene, with the exception of China and Russia, which those are the only two markets around the world where the local players are still able to maintain market share in terms of active usage. The growth and active usage of social platforms is also being driven by older internet users, and that's a point I didn't touch on in this presentation. It is covered in the report that this comes off of, but older internet users are also really driving usage of these platforms, and that's a very interesting thing, especially when we start to consider kind of the demographic shifts occurring, especially in Western Europe, North America, and Japan.
So what you're saying there is that it's not just, we sometimes think that it's the millennials or what we may think of the younger demographic that's flocking to these networks, but that's not necessarily what you're saying. You're seeing something like mobile, the impact of mobile usage on social network usage and people spending time on social networks is driven by an older demographic as much as it is by the younger.
Absolutely. I think that's actually, I removed those slides for this presentation, and now I'm probably regretting that a little bit.
Well,
did it mostly for
good. Yeah.
Did it mostly
At least you know that people, that's the kind of information, if people do want more information, they can reach out to you and go into that kind, that's the kind of depth that GlobalWebIndex provides, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. Within our survey, I mean, you saw that I was using iOS and Android users for it. We have, I love, one of my dev guys came up to me, we had to make a few changes to the database, and he said, Brett, there's 150 million data points in our database every quarter that get added. So that really speaks to the volume of data we have. But yeah, going back, that's a tangential point. But going back to the older internet users, yeah, absolutely. We've seen the fastest growth in active users is actually coming from the 45 to 64-year-old segments at a global level for all the major social networks and social media platforms.
And to jump up to the mobile piece there, I think it is, and I'm glad that you highlighted that piece and that that you presented that data. I think on the basis, we hear a lot about the links between social and mobile, and in some instances you can kind of, you think, okay, it's maybe somewhat intuitive, but it's good to also see the data that backs that up, and the fact that as we do maybe, we talk about, well, as you pointed out, it's maybe more kind of Western world or previously developed world countries that tend to maybe use the term post-PC era, because the PC era didn't really exist in parts of Asia and other parts of the world. But as we move into that era, that you can actually, that you see that close relationship between mobile consumption of social platforms, I guess, is the bottom line there, which is
absolutely, absolutely, that's absolutely true.
Okay.
And I guess kind of the last 2 points are just touching on the major social platforms, and we're really looking at Facebook having the highest active user penetration among its account owners at 82% globally. I think that really speaks to the investment that Facebook has poured in, not only to mobile, but also to visualizing the platform as a whole. They've done a lot with News Feed and with a lot of their recent updates to Facebook itself. So that's really starting to pay off for them. Twitter is the fastest growing social platform globally, and as we saw, it's increasing actually at 44%. That's a typo on my behalf. Apologies for that. And Google Plus is still the second largest social platform in the world. It has 359 million active users aged 16 to 64 across the 31 markets that we cover. So that is the key takeaways, and I always encourage everyone. We do have a lot more stuff, and obviously this is it's an academic outreach program, so I don't want to sell to you guys, but you can find a lot more information online through our website at globalwebindex.net. And also, we release lots of cool stats and facts on Google Plus and Twitter. So we're at GlobalWebIndex, and it's plus GlobalWebIndex on Google Plus. So I definitely encourage you guys to check us out.
Many thanks, Brett, for spending this time today and taking us through this fascinating research you've got, which really paints a picture of what social media usage looks like across the world, both usage and account sign-ups and the impact, say, mobile is having on that, and China and its clampdown on people accessing services outside of its territory. Maybe one final question I have for you. I know you mentioned early on that you work, say some of your clients will be in the advertising and marketing space. Mm-hmm. And can you just talk maybe, just broadly about, kind of engagement, what that looks like, what kind of questions they ask you, how you might get involved with their campaigns, that kind of piece to help our students understand how, the impact this kind of data can have when it comes to, say, executing on a campaign or a advertisement project, let's say, that's
sure.
the marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Daryl just said, our primary clients are advertisers and marketers. We do work with quite a few brand clients as well, but usually in the marketing function. I'm going to take an example of a recent project that I worked on, and the idea was that they were working for a large international consumer packaged goods company, and we were working in conjunction with the agency and the end client themselves. And basically the task was that they wanted to understand, one, not only how does, as we've just seen here, how does social media and its overall online usage differ around the world? So they needed to understand that because they're doing a big multinational campaign. They want to understand how they need to differentiate that as they go into each market. And so what we did really was we kind of took all the data we have. So we'll take all this data, we'll look at it all, and we build what we call frameworks around the data that really help make actionable decisions. They'll highlight, is search marketing going to be more important, and for this target audience in this country, is it going to be more, or is social going to be more important in this country, etc. And we took a very specific target audience. So in this case, we were looking at mothers aged 25 to 35 who fit a certain kind of attitudinal profile, which was really that they were very price conscious, and they weren't very flashy, but they did care about their beauty, kind of in a natural beauty sense. So really thinking about it from a marketer's point of view and thinking about how the brand values fit the campaign, we built the audiences within the data set, and then we obviously got all the data out as we would have here. And what we built at the end of the day was a kind of a scorecard. And that scorecard had everything from kind of what was called digital readiness, for example, where we gave gave arbitrary scores to that target audience across the 6 countries we were working on in this case. And that was things like connection speed, internet penetration, attitudes towards digital. So that focused on a lot of like attitudes towards privacy, kind of their e-commerce habits, how likely are they going to be to use the internet to buy products, to research products, etc. Then we looked at so that's kind of like really the overall strategy, getting that in place. And then once we've got that in place, we'll start to look at their kind of communications channel planning, which is what channels, at least in this sense it was all digital, what digital channels can we use to make sure we're getting in front of these people as marketers, because we need to get the message out. And so we looked at their social media usage, we looked at the websites that they're visiting online, we looked at the amount of time they're spending on each of these channels. And then that allows the marketers to say, okay, well, as an example, that we've got, they're spending 46% of our target audience in Indonesia is on Facebook, and in the UK it's 66%. So that gives a really good idea of the resource, the budget allocation that they should allocate to Facebook in both Indonesia and the UK, for example. And then from that, they'll move on and they can use the data for actually planning the messages. So within our data set, we'll also have a lot of questions to where we ask consumers about how they prefer to be engaged with brands or how they prefer brands to engage them. So it's everything from providing coupons to asking them about ideas for product development to just providing simple customer service using Twitter or social networks or what have you. And so we'll look at a lot of that data, and that really helps them tailor their messages, tailor the services they provide around the products, and really tailor the planning for the actual delivery of the campaign and all the creative and collateral that they're going to build as part of that. And once they've got all that done, then they'll actually launch the campaign. That's unfortunately where my job stops. Once all the planning's done, all the research is done, and then they'll implement various tracking solutions. And it should be said, as part of that planning process, there's a series of key performance indicators that are put in place to measure the campaign and measure the success of the campaign based on what we expect. And those are also built using the data. So I hope that's a good overview. I mean,
yeah, definitely, and fascinating to see how this impact that data can have in terms of the execution of something like an advertising campaign, and to make sure
Absolutely.
that you can, and the fact also that your last point there, that you can measure it back as well to say, okay, is it the extent to which this is working, which I'd suggest maybe going back maybe 10, 15 years, advertising wasn't necessarily in that position to maybe have that level of engagement, or it would have not at this depth, and with the fact that you do quarterly reports as opposed to like having a yearly, or I know we've seen survey results in marketing intelligence which could take years to complete. So it's
exactly. I think that's good. Well, we're under a lot of pressure to get really fast turnarounds, and I think from the time we complete our research, we turn around the data in 2 days and get it out to our clients. So
okay.
it's a really, and I mean, online is such a fast-paced environment, and the changes we've seen just in the last 3 years since we've been doing it has been very significant.
Sure.
Great.
Well, many thanks, Brett, for taking this time today going through this. I know there's a lot of information here and a lot more that you can provide. So this is really, I think, paints a picture of the current global context in which social media is, which we engage with social media currently as a planet, and also to see the dynamic nature of that. So I'm sure if we regrouped in a year, this may look quite different. So
I'm sure it would.
fascinating. So many thanks. Thanks again, Brett.
Absolutely, my pleasure.